All right, guys. The next thing that we are going to do is we're going to move on to our anaerobic cellular respiration. In this case, we're still looking at what comes out of glycolysis. All right, but then we had the option of going aerobic versus anaerobic. And now we're looking at anaerobic. So, we got two different types. We have lactic acid fermentation, where our glucose is going to be broken down into those pyruvates in glycolysis. But now, those pyruvates are going to be altered a little bit so that glycolysis can keep going. Right? What's going to happen is that glycolysis is the only place where the ATP is going to be made. Remember, glycolysis makes 2 ATP. So the idea is to make 2 ATP, make 2 ATP, make 2 ATP. So long as lactic acid fermentation continues, the cells will at least be getting 2 ATP. The pyruvate, in turn, is going to be turned into lactic acid. So what goes in is glucose, and what comes out are 2 ATP that are coming from the glycolysis, and 2 lactic acids. And I guess if you really want to think about it, you could talk about the fact that an NAD is coming out, because the NADH from glycolysis is going to be uncharged after lactic acid fermentation. It's taking place in the cytoplasm, just like all the other anaerobic cellular respiration processes, and oxygen is not going to be needed. So, if we wanted to look at a picture, we've got that glucose that goes through glycolysis and ends up as 2 pyruvates. Those 2 pyruvates are then going to be adjusted a little. So what's going to happen is those pyruvates are going to be altered a little bit, and that NADH is going to come in, and now it's going to drop off an H. So what's going to happen is that the lactic acid is going to have H's. If we really need to show, we've got H's that are going to be added on to these molecules. And we've got 2 lactic acids that are formed. All right? You guys are going to need to look into about lactic acid, how lactic acid is related to us. You can look and find out about lactic acid fermentation with exercise, as well as lactic acid fermentation with food items. So, for food items, all right, we use it for cheese and yogurt. All right? In terms of exercise, you exercise too much, and what's going to happen is your cells aren't going to be getting enough oxygen, so they're going to turn into their backup mode of lactic acid fermentation, and they're going to start to build up lactic acid in your cells, which is going to start to fatigue your cells, cause muscle cramps, all right? You know that feeling that you get after you've been running. So that's lactic acid building up in your cells. I want you guys to research more for your test questions or your test essays about these areas. So lactic acid actually has the ability to go to your liver, and it can actually be reversed. So the nice thing about lactic acid fermentation is that your cells can send the lactic acid back to becoming pyruvate. And once oxygen becomes available again, so once you stop exercising and huffing and puffing and get your breathing under control, you can switch back into aerobic cellular respiration and make plenty of energy. Another method of anaerobic cellular respiration is alcoholic fermentation. In this case, same thing, glucose is broken down in glycolysis into 2 pyruvates, and the NADH from glycolysis is going to be turned into a NAD+. It's going to be uncharged, all right, so that the glycolysis can continue. We can keep getting 2 ATP, 2 ATP, 2 ATP. But this time, there's a little bit of a difference. The pyruvate is going to be turned into ethanol or ethyl alcohol. What's going to happen is it's going to lose a carbon as carbon dioxide, and what's going to be left of the 2 carbons in the form of ethanol. Glucose is what goes in, 2 ATP, 2 ethanols, and 2 CO2s will come out because 2 pyruvates are going in, so everything is times 2. And it's going to take place in the cytoplasm just like everything else, and no oxygen is needed. Alcoholic fermentation diagram. So glucose goes into glycolysis, and what's going to happen is it splits in the whole process of glycolysis, and we end up with 2 pyruvates. Each of those pyruvates is moving on to alcoholic fermentation processes where the NADH is going to come in, drop off a hydrogen, and a carbon is going to be lost. So we're actually going to be losing one of those carbon molecules in the form of CO2. When we lose that carbon molecule, we end up with only 2 left over, and those 2 left over are ethanol. All right? So examples of alcoholic fermentation is that yeast use this. Yeast is a fungus. All right? bread rises because we add yeast to the bread dough, and the bread dough is typically made with some sort of grain, flour, all right? And that flour is a carbohydrate. The carbohydrate has glucose, so there's plenty of food for the yeast. The yeast starts to go through cellular respiration. When there's not enough oxygen available, they'll go into anaerobic cellular respiration. For yeast, their form of anaerobic cellular respiration is alcoholic fermentation. As they go through alcoholic fermentation, carbon dioxide bubbles start to form, and those bubbles are what make bread dough rise. So if you're wondering about why there's no alcohol in bread, it's because as you cook the bread, the alcohol content burns off. Bread dough, however, has traces of alcohol. It kind of has a bitter taste because of that alcohol content. Alcoholic fermentation is also what's used to make beer and wine. The yeast is added to the fermenting mixture, all right, to the mixture that's meant to be fermented, and the alcohol is produced as a waste product. This is a nice little picture showing us our two processes of fermentation and how they're a little different. If you notice here, our big difference is that we lose that carbon dioxide, turning it into a 2-carbon compound, and we end with 2. In this case, no loss of carbon, so we continue with our 3. And this is a nice little diagram that shows us some different foods and different other types of items that are used by making cellular respiration occur in living things. So, our overall respiration summary, all right? All cellular respiration provides ATP, all right, so that cells can function, carry out all of the life processes that an organism needs to survive. All right, when the energy is needed, the phosphate bonds are broken in the ATP, creating ADP, and that breaking of the phosphate bonds releases the energy. Lots of ATP is necessary, all right? In order for all of our cells to have all of the energy that they need, all of those cells need to be going through cellular respiration. They can't be taking breaks, right? We're a relatively large organism. We require aerobic cellular respiration for that 38 ATP. Our anaerobic cellular respiration, lactic acid fermentation, it's a backup. It's not going to be able to sustain us because there's not enough ATP for our life processes to take place. However, smaller microscopic organisms may be able to sustain, like bacteria, on just anaerobic. So it can be aerobic or anaerobic. Small organisms are going to use the anaerobic. Large organisms are going to use anaerobic when there's no oxygen, right? Some small organisms, they'll do aerobic when there's oxygen present, all right? Anaerobic is just a backup, all right? You'd rather have 38 ATP than 2 ATP. But small organisms can survive on the anaerobic, all right? 38, so it's more efficient. Glycolysis is going to occur in both. It happens in the cytoplasm, as well as all of the other anaerobic processes are happening in the cytoplasm, because glycolysis typically, or technically, I'm sorry, does not require oxygen, so I guess you could kind of consider it an anaerobic step, all right, but it's still a step in both. Last thing to point out is the fact that which type of anaerobic cellular respiration an organism uses completely depends on what that organism is. All right, so everything can't do either or. We can't do alcoholic fermentation. We only do lactic acid fermentation. Yeast can only do alcoholic fermentation. They can't do lactic acid fermentation. So it depends on what you are to determine which type of fermentation you use. On that note, that wraps up our anaerobic cellular respiration as well as cellular respiration as a whole.